Good afternoon, everybody. This rather surreal experience of doing a webinar and sharing it is new to me, and we've already had a number of technical glitches along the way, so I hope this goes smoothly and I hope it works for everybody. We have got in the background Kate, who is picking up questions that you may want to pose, so please put as many questions forward as you can. This webinar is, as you can see, about the future of brain injury rehabilitation and what that looks like. And it's just a conversation really between people involved in the field. So myself, I'll introduce myself in a moment, and three colleagues from with the backing of NRC medical experts and NR Times. So an informal discussion. We've done some preparation obviously, but very much a conversation with all of you who are coming online. So shall I just introduce myself, Kate?
Yes, I think if you can start now, Ed, we can see participants have entered.
Okay. So shall I run all that again?
No, I think just let's get started.
Okay, next slide, please. So good afternoon, Edmund Bonikowski. I'm a consultant in rehabilitation medicine, substantially neurological rehabilitation, about 30 years now. And I've had a number of different guises along the way, originally a chartered mechanical engineer, and then I've worked commercially quite a lot. But at the moment, I'm founder of NRC Medical Experts and also the clinical director of rehabilitation in Somerset, for the county of Somerset. So that's me. I'm chairing the session, and I'm joined by our three colleagues whom you will see now on the next slide. Ian Pearce, Catrin May, and John Davis. And so I'm going to ask each to say a few words about themselves, just to introduce themselves to you, and then I'll say a few more words about the background to the talk. Ian.
Thank you, Ed. Yeah, good afternoon all. I am CEO of NeuroProactive, which is an online an app-based digital platform for neurological rehabilitation. The platform covers 6 ASD disciplines to offer a real multidisciplinary approach to rehabilitation. We also include family members on the platform. We're built to medical device standards and currently rolling out 22 NHS trusts all over the UK. I should probably say that 0 medical qualifications whatsoever, so the platform has been entirely developed with the experience and the professionals that we've consulted all over the country. Possibly and rather uniquely as well, the platform is suitable for not just NHS, but also private practitioners, as we all know, and as I'm sure we'll discuss later on, rehabilitation does require NHS and private interaction, and we hope to facilitate that through the use of digital platform.
Thanks very much, Ian. That's very helpful. Catrin, would you like to say a few words about yourself, please?
Yes, good evening, everyone. My name's Catrin. I have been a case manager for 13 or 14 years working with brain and spinal injuries. I have a particular interest in birth injury and brain injury. I've set up a case management company 4 years ago with my business partner, Annabelle Lofthouse, and we are doing our best to do the very best we can in rehabilitation.
Thank you very much. And finally, John, would you introduce yourself?
Thanks, Ed. Yes, good evening, everybody. I'm John Davis. I'm a solicitor. I've been working with clients with brain and spinal cord injury for over 30 years. I think my contribution to today's panel discussion will be really to talk about the future of rehabilitation from that perspective, bearing in mind that a lot of privately funded rehabilitation is funded through litigation and through claims that are being pursued by seriously injured people. And so in many ways, the future of rehabilitation is very much hand in hand with the future of litigation and the future of developments in that sphere. So I'm interested to hear what's going to be said today and how that interfaces with the legal perspective. I know there are some lawyers in the audience today. I'd be interested to hear their perspectives too. So hopefully it will be an interesting and open flowing discussion today.
Great, thanks very much, John. So as you can see, we've got a nice eclectic collection of people on the panel. Hopefully it can give some useful perspective, a wide perspective on this field, stimulated by your questions and also some of the work we've done. Thank you, Kate. Let's have the next slide. So what does the future of brain injury rehabilitation look like? Well, as you can see, we've made the comment here that the sector has made huge strides over the years, and I think that's probably true over the course of decades, in order to help people meet the needs of people living with life-changing injuries. But I think we need to understand the context of the future, because things have changed markedly, in my view, over the course of the last few years. And we are going to have to be, I think, very fleet of foot and active in order to improve the lot of people with brain injury, living with brain injury, and to help those who are trying to help them to do a more comprehensive job. So next slide, please, Kate. So what I wanted to convey here, this is a reference that I go back to time and time again. It's a document produced by the Neurological Alliance, and this is Neuro Numbers 2019. And I wanted to just give some perspective about where brain injury, acquired brain injury, sits in the overall picture of neurological problems. Because for us working in the field, it can feel like there's nothing else out there in healthcare, whereas clearly that is very far from the case. And I'm concentrating here only on the neurological problems. Clearly, you know, we're in a sort of scrap with heart disease and cancers and mental health for resources. So in England, and it is just England, these numbers just give you a sense of scale. I think there's some question marks about just how valid they are, but prevalence, about just over 1 million people living with traumatic brain injury in England, and the incidence, surprisingly, is 900,000. This is 900,000 people attending A&E in any one year, and obviously the vast majority, 81% there, are mild injuries, 11% moderate, and 8% severe. I think the interpretation of those numbers takes quite a bit of doing, actually. And I'm not sure quite how accurate they are, but look, what it says is this is a very big problem. And if you look at the context of brain injury within neurological problems, these numbers are interesting. One or more conditions. So how many people in England are living with one or more neurological conditions? Well, look, 9.5 million nearly. How many were admitted to accident and emergency? To hospital admission rather, 1.6 million, of which 1 million emergencies. And there are 12, nearly 13 million bed days with a neuro mention. So neurological problems are very, very numerous, and brain injury actually is a relatively small part of that. So again, we're in a scrap for resources within our own field. Next slide, please, Kate. So here we have, if we look at brain injury itself, got traumatic brain injury, as I said in the last slide, but you've got stroke. You know, that's a brain injury. 80,000 new strokes a year, 1 million people living with it. Encephalitis is a brain injury. No prevalence numbers, but 5,000 new cases a year. Cerebral palsy, there's the prevalence. Cavernoma, big prevalence. Tumor, 7,000 new tumors, but 85,000 people living with tumor. All of these conditions are brain injuries. So I think we need to be clear that when we're talking about brain injury, what we're talking about. Yes, traumatic, but yes, lots of other causes. Okay, thanks, Kate. And then other conditions, non-brain injury in the neuro context. Look at some of these very, very large numbers. Some of which are not necessarily dealt with by the neurology services, but we're looking at huge numbers of people with fibromyalgia, over 1 million people. Parkinson's disease, 120,000 people. Dementia, 180,000 new cases a year, and a prevalence of sort of 750,000. So when you add all of those up, and then you try and say, well, acquired brain injury is really important. Well, yes, it is very important to those people with it and those people working with it. But in the overall scheme of healthcare provision, actually, we are just a part. And I think it's really important to bear that in mind. Equally, building on the general expansion of neurological services and neurorehabilitation services is probably a good strategy in order to advance the provision for brain injury alone. Okay, thanks, Kate. So, is neuro rehab facing its biggest challenge yet? Well, this will be very familiar to all of you. Clearly, COVID-19 has made an enormous impact on our rehabilitation services for two reasons, principally. One, acute redeployment of staff during the early phases of the pandemic. And then we have to provide the rehabilitation for people post-acute and then in the chronic phase of COVID-19 with long COVID. And it is suggested that we have a tidal wave about to hit us in terms of the demand for the various therapies and rehabilitation services that are out there. So that's one big pressure. Another is the carer crisis, about which we hear so much. And we are struggling in this country to fund carers sufficiently well to entice them into care or indeed retain them. And many are, heard on the news yesterday, being seduced away into the logistics business, so delivery, because they can be paid £15 an hour. It seems tragic that we can't pay enough to retain people with the skills that they already have. We've got a low national priority for neurorehabilitation, and that has been a long-standing chronic problem. And I think my profession bears some of the responsibility for that. I and my colleagues have shouted as loudly as we can with organisations like the British Society of Rehabilitation Medicine, but one way or another we haven't been as effective as we would have hoped. There's chronic underfunding, as I've said, and then really I think one of the biggest challenges we have is relatively poor quality provision, especially in the community. And I'm talking about for those who need intensive input and care. I'm talking about relatively generic nursing homes branding themselves as neurological rehabilitation facilities. And I know from my experience, I've visited a number and been appalled at the quality of what is on offer. So I think we have some really very big issues here facing this world of acquired brain injury rehabilitation. So ABI, just part of the big neurorehabilitation picture. Thank you, Kate. So we need to see a way forwards, and clearly innovation is what we need in order to improve the situation. It's that we need to base our future on innovations in technology and potentially artificial intelligence to try and change outcomes for patients. Okay. So what I'd like you to do with that very brief cursory introduction is to take part, and please use the Q&A format now to pose us some questions, and we will do our best to answer those. And here we have a question already from an anonymous attendee. Do you think the new ABI strategy being launched by the government will bring additional funding? Okay, why don't we ask Catrin? Would you like to start us off on that one, Catrin?
Well, I was talking to John and Ian about this a little earlier, and I think they've probably got more to say about it because they understand, well, I didn't understand the difference between a bill and a strategy. And so I have been educated in that this afternoon, but I think that is actually quite significant, isn't it? And in answering that, so I'm going to hand that over to John.
John, come in then and rescue us both, because I'm relatively ignorant on that too.
Yeah, well, I'm going to hand over to Ian in a moment, but before I do that, because I know Ian's had some personal direct discussions around the bill and has maybe some greater inside information than any of the other panelists. But my excitement about the government's agreement to engage in discussions around a brain injury strategy was tempered a little bit by a realization that what we would have had if the bill had become law, if we'd had an act about ABI and a statutory obligation on the part of the government to devise a strategy and to make resources available to meet the strategic objectives that had been put into that strategy. Without some statutory authority or some statutory impetus or obligation to pursue that strategy or to devise the strategy in a way that was going to meet the needs of people who needed to be served by the strategy, it becomes a bit of a more empty vessel, because there is now very little pressure that can be brought to bear upon the government to actually implement the strategic aims that it now is prepared to put pen to paper about. Right. So that was my slight disappointment about the news last week. And Ian, I know you have some thoughts too, so I think we'd all be interested to hear those.
Yes, please, Ian, do.
Absolutely, yeah. So I think John is absolutely right in terms of the difference between a bill being passed from a legal perspective and having this enshrined in law. I had a conversation with Chris Bryant about this at the UK Acquired Brain Injury Conference, and as is my way, I tend to sort of go straight for the jugular on these kinds of issues, and actually had a meeting with Rishi Sunak about this, because from the UK government's perspective, we know the scale of the problem, and I think, Ed, you know, those slides really sort of highlight how prevalent, you know, neurological conditions are. But when it comes to ultimately what will move the government on this will not be their promise for an ABI strategy. What will move them and bring additional funding into neurological rehabilitation will be pointing out to them the cost, the UK economy, of not bringing additional funding in. Yeah. Now, I did a bit of research myself on this and looked at the numbers that came out of the Time for Change report and the numbers that the Neurological Alliance had published. But the numbers that I was interested in was the costs to the UK economy of each of these different conditions. And actually, it was quite easy to find. So I looked at the top 6 most prevalent neurological conditions and tried to find a figure that had been made available by each of the NGOs that represent those conditions. And the number that I continue to push in all of my conversations is that the top 6 most prevalent neurological conditions combined cost the UK economy £80 billion per year. Now that is an enormous number, right? That's equivalent to 2 furlough schemes every year. You know, COVID, no COVID. It's an enormous drain on the UK economy. And what I said to Sunak was, look, trying to address this issue with funding is not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do. And he was pretty taken aback by that number. Now we can argue about whether argue about the accuracy of all the various, you know, costs of the conditions that come to make that number, but at the end of the day, whether it's 70 billion or 80 billion is kind of irrelevant, because what we need is 10 billion per year, maybe more, committed to additional resource in neurological rehabilitation. And Absolutely. That just makes sense.
It absolutely does make sense. And sorry, Ian, your microphone's reverberating quite loudly. I probably want
sorry.
to just move slightly away. I think the number 80 billion is important to hang on to, because when we put up bald figures for prevalence and incidence, that doesn't really tell us anything about the impact of the condition. We're not looking at the extent of impairment, or the problem with activity, or the problem with participation. Of course, that is what ultimately costs people their livelihoods and their families, and cost them their activity in society. And that's really where the government probably needs to have a look and try and ascertain data at a much more granular and different level. So, for example, the quotation from the Neuro numbers is that Britain is a data desert when it comes to neurological conditions. And I know that to be true personally, because in Somerset, we're trying to reorganise the neurological rehabilitation service. And actually, one cannot get even the most basic data out of the healthcare scheme. Just cannot get at it. And therefore, it's very hard to say, well, how much service would be required to achieve a certain amount of gain. Extremely difficult. Okay. So, I mean, my feeling about...
just jump in on that.
Yeah, please do. Yeah.
I absolutely agree with you. Data is incredibly hard to get. And even if you were to sort of forensically try and focus on getting that data, it would take resource out of the clinical teams. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword, really.
Well, I think that's right. That's a bit how you do it.
We have a substantial rollout, which we've just announced in Wales, in the major trauma network in Wales, which covers 6 of the 7 health boards. And one of the reasons that I'm really excited about what we're doing with NeuroProactive in Wales is for 3 reasons. One, the major trauma network in Wales covers somewhere between 750 to 1,000 patients. So it's a big rollout. The second thing that we're doing is we're integrating with electronic patient records in Wales. That's pretty transformational itself. But the third thing that we're doing, and this is the really exciting bit, is we have a research organization called CEDAR, which is a joint venture between Cardiff University and Cardiff and Vale University Health Board.
Yep.
And what CEDAR are doing is they will be performing a research study on that rollout in Wales, and that will look at patient outcomes. It will look at health economics, both in terms of what the health economic derivative of those patient outcomes is, but it will also look at the cost savings to a therapy team with our platform. And that research study is being funded by the World Economic Forum. So it's pretty, and that research study, I believe, will be published sometime in March of next year. So
okay,
hopefully we'll leverage that.
That sounds like a really big step forward, and I think I congratulate you on that. My feeling about these government initiatives is that one's seen a number of them over the course of a career, and sadly, I think they often lack teeth because, as I said, government, central government and funder holders, purse holders are trying to juggle a very big set of problems, and we are just one small part of that. Okay, I think we should probably move away slightly now. But another question in here. It says, anonymous attendee, in the last webinar, Mike Barnes talked about the rehabilitation prescription. Surely if this was completed in every one, it would show the scale of need. Do all panelists use it here, for example? Well, that is possibly true, in my view. It would certainly be true for the most severe brain injured people, because they would certainly be the subject of a rehabilitation prescription. It wouldn't be true for those people who suffer a mild brain injury. And of course, the huge burden of impact probably does come from mild brain injury because of the sheer numbers. So I think there's certainly the rehabilitation prescription has a great deal to offer, but it is not implemented in the vast majority of cases, in my experience, in the NHS. And I think, do all panelists here use it, for example? I very seldom come across them, either in the NHS or in our medico-legal practice.
I think the whole idea of a rehab prescription is a brilliant one, but sadly we very rarely see it. And I've seen rehab prescriptions that have said take paracetamol when you have a headache, and that's all the advice that has been given to the client. So if it was used properly, I think it would be great, but it rarely is.
I think it would. John, do you see them at all from your perspective in your cases legally?
We see them, and we see them usually in the form of a piece of paper in the medical records that we obtain for our clients. But from the perspective of a client who's got a strong litigation claim, they become irrelevant pretty early on, because and this is where there's a bit of a divergence in the schemes of input that are available for people who've got compensation claims and those who haven't. Very much is a twin track arrangement here, where people who've got access to funds get a very good level of input that meet their needs. It's speedy and it's focused on their particular needs, and it's aimed at providing outcomes that are tailored to the needs of the individual person. Within the NHS, we all know that there is a different story altogether going on, and that very often we just see a totally different level of input, different level of service, different level of review, people dropping off the edge of the system and so on. And I look upon rehabilitation prescriptions largely as a in many cases, not every case of course, but in many cases it's a form filling exercise, which, as Catrin says, is a great idea in principle, but the reality on the ground is very different to that, I'm afraid.
That's very interesting, John, and indeed I think that has become a form-filling exercise. The aspiration, of course, with the rehabilitation prescription was that it would remain a live document which had been created right at the outset of a person's injury. And indeed, I know this person now, and I worked in Cambridge for a while in the neurointensive care there, and was completing rehabilitation prescriptions on people who'd come off the road the day before. And that's how early into rehabilitation we were in Cambridge. However, that was 10 years ago when the RP first came about, and I think they have fallen fundamentally into disuse. So that is a service, that is a provision that we are trying to make with NRC medical experts, for example, to get our consultants to draft those prescriptions in detail, not just take a paracetamol if you have a headache, and to see them become live for patients as they progress through their rehabilitation. Got another couple of questions here. Simon in Edinburgh. What management or leadership to embrace the tech-led change will the NHS need? Brackets, they ain't got it. They can't even use email to communicate to patients. The speed of change will overwhelm them, and patient demand will drive structural stress. Well, I'm going to put my hand up briefly here because amongst my other roles, I am an active researcher in AI and healthcare in Cambridge, and I agree entirely with what Simon has said there. This is a real problem, and unless there is some kind of infrastructure for handling this in the health service, it would be very, very difficult for us, even in the short to medium term, to make an impact. Ian, you're probably the most relevant person for me to come to first for a comment on that.
Yeah, well, I will give you the nuts and bolts of my experience of this over the last 4 years. And I think there is within clinical teams, there is a desire for technology. There is a desire for anything which can make their lives easier and improve patient outcomes. One of the problems that we have in England is that there are a plethora of organisations who are responsible for innovation in the NHS nationally. And I'm just going to say straight out, I find them incredibly ineffective. All right. Some of them have funding schemes for innovations exactly like NeuroProactive, which have been built on, you know, clinical patient participation. But they have an absolute obsession with anything that's got AI written on it. Clinical teams have an obsession with anything that doesn't have AI written on it. And every time, you know, I was in Istanbul last week, a lot of AI companies there in healthcare. It is a positive obsession at the moment, but and it's had funding thrown at it, you know, from government entities. It's produced very little, and it is likely to produce very little for two reasons. One, if you don't have good quality data, you can't employ machine learning effectively, or what some people call AI. There is a big difference between the two, and every time I meet somebody from the NIHR or UKRI or the AHSNs, and they start talking about AI, I ask them, what is the difference between machine learning and artificial intelligence? And they haven't got a clue. Now I know what the difference.
Don't go there, Ian, because that's going to drive us all mad. The technical difference. I mean, please, I know you can give us a lecture on it, but don't. I think what we need to do is we probably need to move things along a bit.
Absolutely, absolutely. Sorry, I mean, I could talk about this for hours.
I'm sure you could. I'm sure you could.
Simon is absolutely right.
I would enjoy that conversation with you, but perhaps not in this forum at great depth. Let's just move along. There's a couple of interesting questions here. How can families become more involved? Oh, hello. Where's that gone now? How can families become more involved in rehabilitation? That seems to be an area we often neglect. Catrin, do you want to have a shot at that? I've got a few ideas.
Actually, this is one of my passions, if you like, working with families and getting families as involved as possible.
Cool.
And I think that it needs to be recognised that when somebody has a brain injury, it doesn't just affect the person, it affects the whole family. And I think more help needs to be given to those families in understanding brain injury and the effects of it and what they can do to help. And I think it's mainly down to education and involvement.
And the key question here is, how can families become more involved? And I think it's about the professionals being completely open to the involvement of families, encouraging it. Some of the charities, Headway, of course, encourages it. And of course, you know, picking up on Ian's point about data, you know, we can look to families to provide a lot of data, but you've got to have a hopper into which that data can be fed. You have to have a portal. So I think families can become more involved by becoming more involved. It sounds a bit self-serving there, but I think that's the truth. It's about, you know, if you've got something to say, there's no better platform now than the internet for saying it, then say it, because somewhere along the line, someone will be able to hoover that data up. So I think that's really important, is shout about your situation, both patients, clients, as we like to call them in the private world, and family members. Enormously valuable contribution from families. And Catrin's absolutely right there, that they are very, very profoundly affected. John, any thoughts on that?
Yeah, very, very similar to Catrin's comment. I mean, in my world, families are always encouraged to be as involved as they want to be, and it's got to be recognised that there's some families who want to return to their lives before a serious neurological trauma was imposed upon the family and the whole circle and the whole halo of people around the family. And part of the function of civil damages is to restore everybody to the position they were in before the impact of this trauma occurred. So there is different levels of involvement that people want to have, but in my experience, those people who want to have a lot of engagement can have it, and those people who want to have a lesser engagement can have that. But again, this points rather to the the distinction between a privately funded arrangement and one
Yeah.
where the NHS are at the helm. Because with a privately funded arrangement, we can bring in the likes of Catrin to provide expert case management service at a very high and intensive level, and to bring in other professionals to bring in that support for the family to be engaged. So it may well be that there are certain parts of the community who have a lot of involvement and others that don't.
I think that's absolutely right, John. And certainly my experience is that privately funded case management organised rehabilitation programmes often are the best that can be provided. And I think that the public sector purse just literally cannot afford that. And I think this is where technology has a role to play in improving efficiency of delivery and efficiency of communication, because I think we can learn a great deal from the case management and private rehabilitation sector for the broader good. Let me move on. There are a lot of questions coming in now. So one is, does the panel have access to UK ROC data? I do, because we contribute to it in Somerset. I'm not quite sure what use it really is to us. I think it's useful for giving an overview to any academic or government bodies about what's going on in rehabilitation in the UK. I don't think it's particularly useful at the moment to individual patients, because it's really trying to represent the performance of the various inpatient units in the UK. I know that the UK ROC data was originated by Professor Lynn Turner-Stokes, who's done a fantastic job in setting all of that up and has driven a lot of policy using the data from it, and has demonstrated a lot of the cost benefit of rehabilitation arising from it. But I don't think it's the sort of data that we as individuals usually would have access to. So I just want to move along a bit. It says, John, how can we better support sorry, my screen keeps moving. John, how can we better support patients who can't pursue litigation? John, very directly to you.
Well, it's a great question, and it's not as easy to answer, sadly. There is a haves and have-nots situation. Those who have access to litigation and the damages that generates do have a better journey through the rehabilitation process and a better outcome in many cases at the end of it. I suppose the answer to the question is really focused on the charities and the third sector that provides support for people with serious neurological injury. Headway's been mentioned already, and there are lots of other charities that certainly in my world we always try to signpost and facilitate people being provided with that support if we're not able to help them through the legal process if they don't have a case. But it's not a perfect solution, and it does really just emphasise the fact that there is a two-tier system in place. And
absolutely.
I'd be interested to hear what others have to say, but that's the best I can
Catrin,
do.
That would be interesting to hear from you on this, and I absolutely agree. It's a two-tier system. I mean, the honest answer is people who can't pursue litigation are dependent on the public sector services and to some extent some charity services. Now, that's not to say that the NHS services are not extremely good in pockets, but they are usually focused on the immediate sort of post-acute rehabilitation, which I believe they do well, very well indeed, actually. And one sees that in litigated cases where there's been a tremendous input, some great gains made, and then patients are discharged into the community and it all falls apart. So I think I would not want this seminar to be giving the impression that private good, NHS bad. That is absolutely, in my experience, not the case. But I think that it's horses for courses. The health service is not, as it's currently configured, set up to manage long-term community-based need. It is set up to save life and to repair people immediately, and then to set them on the right course and get them out of hospital as fast as possible. And that's just not consistent with maintaining long-term functional gain. Catrin, did you want to say a few words about this relatively briefly?
Well, I agree with John. The place to go is charities like Headway. And I was reading today, actually, that Headway have just now developed an app called Healthy Note, which is for GPs to help them signpost brain injured people to the right services, which I think is going to be actually really helpful for them. And again, helpful for GPs as well, because I think sometimes GPs don't always know how to help clients with brain injury either.
I think more than that, Catrin, they all, I mean, I trained in general practice and worked in it briefly. GPs in general do not know anything about it, because in terms of the numbers.
Well, I didn't want to say that.
Well,
I did not want to say that.
And I think most GPs would quite openly admit that, because they are very good at the specialist aspects of general practice. They're not good at specialist neurological injury and rehabilitation. And they are only too pleased to be guided and to have the complexity of patients with these sort of injuries taken away from them, for the responsibility to be taken away. There are some other very good questions coming in. There's one here that says, what do you think some of the solutions are to the ongoing challenge of providing quality and effective neurorehabilitation services when you think about some of the providers in the market at the moment? That's quite an interesting question. Isn't it? What are the solutions when you think about the providers in the market at the moment? Not quite sure I fully understand that question. I think my view is that the solutions are doing the basics right and doing the basics early. I don't think we need to reinvent the wheel. I think we know a great deal about what works in rehabilitation and what doesn't. But I think it's a question very substantially of putting into practice what we know works and putting it in often enough so that it makes a difference. There's very good scientific evidence that one needs many thousands of repetitions of some functional tasks in order to embed change in the brain with neuroplasticity. So, we don't need to reinvent the wheel here. We just need to apply what we know. That's my sense. And I'm not quite clear about the questioner's comment about the providers in the market. I think there is a very healthy private market of therapy providers. I'm not sure, notwithstanding the excellent work of case management companies, I'm not sure they are as well organized into multidisciplinary teams as they might be. And certainly I know that my own branch of the rehabilitation professions, rehab physicians, are generally absent from non-NHS rehabilitation programs, and at NRC medical experts we're trying to bridge that gap as well, trying to give a little bit more help to the therapy and nursing teams and case management teams with some medical rehabilitation perspective. Okay, let me just pick another question up here. Simon in Edinburgh, who was on before, said, agree with John, re-NHS provision. Tech has the ability to make patient-led and will revolutionise demand. I agree. I think that's absolutely right. And I think we face, I mean, the ability for patients en masse to provide their data, to give the world at large a perspective on neurological injury and brain injury is really unparalleled. And I think that's tremendously powerful. And I absolutely agree it will revolutionise demand. Ian, you probably want to come in there and just tell us a little more about how it's revolutionising it through NeuroProactive.
Yeah, I'd pick up on a couple of points, really. I think, and I'll try and do it in a more succinct fashion than the question which rolled me earlier on.
I'll stop you if you don't.
First of all, on the back of NeuroProactive, we have built a research database. So every member of the platform has the ability to consent to their anonymized data being transferred to that research database. Which essentially means that as they're using the platform, as they are communicating with therapists, as they are working through their rehabilitation prescription, they can automatically have that data contributed to that research database. And we've been working on that with the NIHR. And the other point that I would want to make, and this goes back to a previous question talking about families in rehabilitation, which is something that is very close to my heart, because the only reason that I got involved in all of this is because my father had a stroke in 2017. Families being involved in rehabilitation is in the National Institute for Health and Care Excellence guidelines. So it isn't just something that people say is helpful to a patient or is good practice. It is officially best practice. And on our platform, we allow each patient or parent guardian, for those who are under 18 or severely cognitively impaired, we allow each patient to appoint up to 3 patient representatives, family members, friends, and they do that for free. So everybody is on the same page, everybody is in the loop, and family members feel like they're in a position where they can help despite not being healthcare professionals.
Yeah, I think that's really, really helpful to have the reality check there that something is really beginning to happen. And I think that's fantastically exciting, actually, Ian. It really is. I think it's been long awaited. Let me move on to a comment, really, from Sabrina, who I think, judging by her surname, I think I recognise the surname. I won't say it, but I think she's a case manager. It says, in the current climate, it is very difficult to arrange a GP appointment. You are lucky to be offered a telephone assessment within a 3-week window waiting list. I have a number of brain injury clients really struggling to arrange GP appointments. I wonder if it would be helpful to have GPs who are specialised, in inverted commas, in neurological conditions. I know there are some specialist nurses in GP surgeries. I'm thinking more for those who do not have a legal claim and the benefit of full funds to access private medical treatment and support. I fear there is a real crisis at the moment in GP surgeries. As a result, people who need support are falling through the net. Well, amen to that. I think that's a very helpful summary, Sabrina. I'm not sure there's a question in there, but panel, Catrin, would you like to comment on that, please?
I think the idea of specialist neuro GPs is a really good one. I don't know if that would alter the ability to get an appointment at the moment. I'm not sure why it's so difficult to get appointments. I guess it's just a backlog of work from COVID days. And yeah, it's tragic and it's awful, but I don't think, although it's a good idea to have specialists, I'm not sure that that would actually provide a solution.
My feeling is it probably wouldn't, because GPs, you would need a lot of specialist knowledge to handle this stuff correctly, I think, helpfully. I think what is probably better is to expand the specialists in the neurological rehabilitation sort of consultant grade, the training grades, and encourage people into this as an interesting medical career, as they are encouraged into the therapies and the nursing aspects of rehabilitation. GPs already wear so many hats, and they are under such pressure that I suspect they would probably not want to have another thing pop up and say, well, why don't we do this? I think it's a great idea, but I just don't think it will gain traction, unfortunately. Okay. There's a question here, or is this a statement? Oh, it is a question. It's got a question mark. As a nurse in a specialist service, I feel a bit apprehensive about the future of the neuro rehab sector, as there seems to be so many difficulties ahead and here and now. Lots of demand. What can we personally do to help? Well, that's very interesting. What can we personally do to help? John, any comment on that?
It is a really good question, particularly now with what's happened following COVID. We know that the NHS waiting lists have gone through the roof. I was looking at some statistics the other day which showed that people waiting for over a year for treatment in the NHS at the beginning of the pandemic was merely a few thousand. And within the space of 12 months, that had risen to 500,000. So yeah. the backlog is huge, and I think it's going to take some years to work our way through the backlog. What we can do to help is difficult to imagine, because the problem is so vast. Certainly from a legal perspective, and I know that I'm speaking purely from this perspective, the position is that insurance companies who are paying for compensation claims, and the NHS, who have a lot of clinical negligence claims against them, there has been a growing willingness on their part over the past 10 years or so to engage in funding rehabilitation, to make funding available at the time it's required within the private sector, and to almost invest in achieving the best possible outcome for the injured person. It's an enlightened investment because funders gain the benefit of people being made as well as they can be, because you can reduce the claims for mobility, accommodation, care, loss of income, and so on. So there's a bit of a commerciality about the way in which the insurance sector invest in making people better. But nonetheless, it's a gift horse that we shouldn't look in its mouth, because if that's going to result in people being provided with the funds to improve their outcomes, well, that's a great thing. The problem is that the demand is now huge because of COVID, but the supply is being affected as well, because a lot of rehabilitation units have had to close their doors. Staff shortages have been an issue. Non-vaccinated staff have had to be let go. And so whilst we've got this booming demand, we've got this contracting supply, and the problem is just doubled because of those two conflicting factors. So as the question says, lots of demand. It's really a long-term question of trying to work out how we meet that demand, and I ain't got the answer, I'm afraid.
No, I don't think anybody will have the answer. And from my point of view, I think it's about, as I said, trying to be more efficient with the resources that we've got and trying to communicate better. And essentially, I think raising the profile of neurological rehabilitation and particularly brain injury rehabilitation. So I think it just try and answer the question very specifically, what can we personally do to help? I think the answer is get active. I think personally, shout about it, write about it, talk to people, and represent your patients, your clients. Ask clients and their families to represent themselves in a way. I think one just has to get a groundswell of activity going. I think that will help to stimulate funding potentially, but it will also help to stimulate innovation. Catrin, any comment from you on that?
Well, I think that nursing, obviously I started nursing a lot of years ago. I just think it's an amazing profession to go into. Gives you lots of opportunity. It's very, very satisfying. And I think we need to get back to thinking that about nursing and valuing nurses. And I'm sure if we do that, then that will help. At the moment, no, nurses feel a little undervalued, don't they?
I think that's absolutely right, Catrin. And, you know, it's not just about nurses, of course, although they make a very profound contribution. It's about carers. You know, we mentioned the carer crisis early on. You know, there's a spectrum of contribution to be made from different professional groups in and around rehabilitation and healthcare. And I think we just have to almost reorientate society to say, look, these are, if you want these sort of services, then join in, come and do some of it. Don't do some of the other jobs that are out there, which maybe pay you a few quid more, because you get a huge benefit working in healthcare, because you are valued for doing it. And I think that's it's a very different employment contract. Okay. Yeah. I think we're reaching our end point. We've got, it's now, I think I'm right in saying 26 minutes past 5. We're due to close at past. So I think it would be a good moment to just summarize very quickly and then ask each of the panel members for their sort of final comments. My summary is that this is a huge elephant of a problem. And you eat it one bite at a time. It feels, I mean, after even 30 years in the field, it still feels unstable and complex. And I think it is, as many of the questioners have identified, worrying that we are in such an unstable position. Even coming into the COVID and care crisis, that has been very substantially exacerbated by those two aspects. My feeling is that the solution is a groundswell of interest and ambition by society to value people who work in the health and caring professions, and also to stimulate technological revolution. Real disruptive technology will make a difference. Just think about the way in which, you know, you get your takeaway nowadays, or where you get a cab. That has yet to hit healthcare. And when it does, it may well provide a substantial part of the solution to these problems. So that's my takeaway on this. Catrin, would you like to make a sort of wrapping up comment?
Well, I agree with everything that you say, and I do think that technology has got an amazing part to play in our future, but I don't want people to forget that there's nothing better than face-to-face, and
Absolutely.
I think that's massively important, particularly for brain injury clients and their families who are often so traumatized. So I would, whilst I welcome digital and all of that, I would hate to think that that was going to be at the cost of the human touch, if you like.
Absolutely right. Ian, final comment from you?
Yeah, I think Catrin makes a really important point. And certainly when we developed NeuroProactive, it was with an idea of, you know, filling in the gaps between those face-to-face sessions as opposed to, you know,
Yes,
doing away with anything face-to-face. I mean, you're absolutely right, Ed, and we know that we've got a huge problem here, but we've known that for many years. And with COVID, it's got bigger, and we're fully aware of that as well. The two things that I'm going to do personally is continues to engage with AHPs, with nurses, with case managers, with rehab consultants all over the UK, as I've been doing for the last 4 years, with a view to making our platform even better than it is now. So that's the first thing that I'm going to do. The second thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to continue to go down to Westminster and lobby for tuition fees to be scrapped for nurses and speech and language therapists and occupational therapists, to have starting salaries raised for those professions. And to anyone who says, well, that's going to be very expensive, who's going to pay for it? I would say, well, we managed to pay the salaries of 80% of the salaries of people who are on furlough nationally. So we should be able to pay our nurses and our AHPs a little bit more.
Very important agenda there, Ian. And I have to say, hearing you talk for the first time, I no doubt you're going to be able to carry that off. I'd welcome a dialogue with you.
Yes.
John, would you like to make some final comments?
Yeah, I would like to mention one thing that hasn't been mentioned in the discussion today, but I do see this as a looming problem that's going to enter into this discussion as time goes along, and that is that in 2017 the point was reached, the tipping point, where more than half of people who were admitted to trauma units were older than 65. The over 65 age group is the one that's growing fastest in the UK. There are 12.5 million people over the age of 65. That bubble is going to get larger and larger as people live longer and as the generation works its way through the demographics. So I suspect that in 5 years, maybe even sooner, we're going to be talking about where neurological trauma meets old age and what does that present to us as a problem. And I think that we'll be having conversations around that in years to come.
Thank you very much. That's a fantastic point to conclude on, if potentially rather a pessimistic one, but it's absolutely right. You know, we have got a number of tidal waves heading towards us, and I think we have to muscle up to meet the challenges. Okay, well, really, it just is for me now to thank the panelists for that discussion, and thank the attendees for your questions and for your attention and coming to the seminar. I hope that has been of some interest to you. Please do feel free to communicate with us outside. And there you are. You can watch the webinar again, and please do get in touch with any of us if you'd like to continue the dialogue. So thank you very much, and good evening, and thank you, panelists.